You're listening to the Ranch Stewards Podcast, a podcast dedicated to the stewardship and conservation of grasslands, diverse ecological landscapes, and the salt of the earth individuals who dedicate their lives to this endeavor. And now here's your host, Haylie Shipp.
Welcome to the latest episode of the Ranch Stewards Podcast. Today we're talking about wildlife-friendly fencing. Now, this is a concept that many ranchers have probably adopted without even realizing it. By building fences that work with wildlife movement rather than against it, ranchers are creating solutions that are not just good for the landscape, but also easier to maintain in the long run. Joining us is Martin Townsend. He is the conservation coordinator with the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. Martin played a key role in bringing in today's guests. I've got Phillips County rancher Mark French, and then Brett Dorak. He is with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Martin is going to share why he saw them as the right voices for this discussion before we dive into their experiences and their insights. And honestly, this conversation hits close to home. I was just out fencing over the weekend, and it dawned on me that we are probably like a lot of ranchers. Without even thinking about it, we have built fences that meet a lot of the wildlife-friendly specs just because it's what makes sense on the ground. We'll get into why that is today on the Ranch Stewards Podcast.
Sure. So, like Haley said, I'm Martin. I've been a part of Ranchers Stewardship Alliance's conservation work since it began, but I've only actually worked for Ranchers Stewardship Alliance for a few months now. Before that, I was a partner biologist in an NRCS office, and then I was a Pheasants Forever position that helped RSA do projects. And when I went to Pheasants Forever, I inherited a set of projects that Brett had started with RSA. Brett worked to put together a big grant that was RSA's first big game efforts, and worked with a bunch of landowners like Mark to put together some fencing projects. So this is really the first fence project that RSA worked on. So I thought these would be good guys to bring in and visit about it. Mark, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, Brett came to me and we asked if we could collar some antelope, and they're going to track their habits and stuff, and then see what kind of impact the fences had on it. And then offered we got on this program to change some fences. And it was interesting with the collared and the mapping that he showed me their habits and how much difference a fence can change the habits of an antelope. And what's very interesting to me to see how I pay a lot more attention now than I ever did before, these tracking devices. And then you can see their habits change. And then the effect that a rancher has is that I have is if they're crossing a fence or breaking the wires, then I got to go fix it and stuff. And a lot of these old fences are wore out, so they need to be upgraded and updated. And if I don't have to fix the fence, it's a lot less time for me. And anyway, a lot more up. That's how Brett and I got going on this thing, and it's been a good program that's working for me. And I see the antelope, it's working for them too.
Great. Brett, why don't you give us your introduction?
Yeah, so I'm Brett Dorak, currently now the wildlife manager out of Miles City, down in southeast Montana for Region 7 for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. But prior to that, I was the wildlife biologist out of Malta. Worked heavily with the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance, their conservation committee. And as Martin alluded to, applied for about a $500,000 grant for RSA. With the primary purpose of that grant was to help with wildlife fencing, agriculture fencing out on the landscape through some of the findings we had going on at the time through the statewide Pronghorn research project. The herd in Phillips County was one of the herds that was selected for the collar deployment, and we initially collared about 60 female pronghorn, or antelope that they're commonly referred to. And it didn't take long for them to show some of their movements across the landscape. Really remarkable movements. I know there was one right there on Mark's property that as the fall seasons changed, within about a day and a half, she moved all the way down to the UL Bend, and you could see some of the fences and barriers that she moved into. And after that cold front moved through, she was real quick to move right back up to Mark's ranch. So she really enjoyed it there. And seeing some of the movements, seeing some of the barriers, talking about it within RSA and the Conservation Committee and a lot of the landowners, really put the emphasis on, we can do better for the agricultural producers with fencing, and we, as well as we can do better for wildlife movements. And yeah, Mark and some of his neighbors and family members were early on board to hop onto it, kind of like he said. You've got some across the landscape, not specifically Mark, but also on some of his property. You've got some old fence, some historical fences, based on the age of the wire and when they were erected, and some in different shapes of need of repair, and some were conducive to antelope movements, deer movements, and some aren't, and we need to be cognizant of it, both for the agricultural producer as well for wildlife. So if we can work together in a good partnership to provide some fencing materials, some fencing options and specs that keep the cattle in the pastures where they need to be, and for some landowners, sheep in pastures where they need to be, but also helps facilitate wildlife movements, it's kind of a win-win for everybody.
Brett, I'm smiling as you're talking. Historical fences. I didn't know I had historical fences. That's when you're trying to stretch it and the wire pops. That's a historical fence.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, Mark, I mean, through the conversations that him and I had, I mean, there were some fences going on that, gosh, we had to figure were probably, 70 plus years old. Some of that wire, didn't we think? I mean, when you look at the different variations of fence over time, you could go across the landscape, across the ranch, and see the change in the barbed wire and the structure and the different type of wire, and barbs that it had on there. So it's, yeah. Historical fence, when you're pulling on it to tighten it, and like you said, it breaks. I think that's a pretty good example of it's run its course, and it's been out on the landscape for quite some time.
And just barbed wire in itself, there's whole coffee table books about the history of barbed wire and how you can go out and look and find the age. So yeah, there's definitely been different materials that have been used. You see the mix of the random straight chunk of wood that's intermingled, with steel fence posts, and that as you dot the landscape. Martin, I'm curious, as it pertains to looking at creating a transition to wildlife friendly fencing. Originally this landscape, of course, did not have fences. Then we came in with homestead times. People were creating improvements on the property. I'm assuming fencing was part of those eligible improvements as they proved up, as they said, on that parcel. And I'm sure wildlife was not a consideration. When did we start seeing this sort of thing looked at and discussed in earnest?
So I think like when you started and you said you accidentally had wildlife friendly fence, I think you'd probably be the same way. You probably accidentally had wildlife friendly fence. Just like before we started recording, you were saying you wanted it where it wasn't touching grass, wasn't touching snow. I don't know if you want to dive into how fences just end up that way.
A lot of the fences out there were put in what I think they're too low. And then you get grass grows over top, lays over top, snow, stuff starts to push it down. And Brett's being kind when he says historical fence, it's old, it's outdated, it's the original one. My mom remembers this is the first fence that went in, and so I know it's a lot of this wire that's out there that you can't stretch and tighten anymore is original stuff. Early 1900s, World War II barbed wire, surplus wire, whatever you want to call it. Anyways, a lot of that stuff that's out there is the original one, and it's just settling and going down and need to be updated and replaced. And so this wildlife friendly program is a great opportunity for producers to update their fence, plus benefit the wildlife at the same time.
Yeah, there's as much maintenance concern that just made fences into more wildlife friendly. Like Mark said, animals breaking wires, snow breaking wires, like a lot of bottom wires especially end up being a little higher. What we run into a lot is, like Mark and Brett have said, fences that are just so old they cannot be maintained to stay wildlife friendly. So Brett can probably go into the preferences of animals, but we really work with ranchers a lot on the preference of ranchers of this 100-year-old fence is beyond repairable. We did one this summer. It was the original county line fence for Phillips and Valley County. So like 1907. And it hadn't been changed or touched since. But when we're dealing with ranches, I think you mentioned 70 plus miles of fence just on 90 on the place that you're on. I know we had Cornell here a couple years ago, and we were at Dale's, and everybody's like, yeah, we have about 90, about 70. And then Dale comes on, he's like 418. At 418 miles.
Yeah.
So it's a ton of fence and a ton of time to get through. So really trying to work with ranchers to meet fences that are their priority to work on, but then also overlap with being restrictive to wildlife movement.
So I love this. There's so much in a name. You know, Mark, you're talking about the on the ground factors that have just created a fence with a higher bottom wire, and how that makes more sense, because if we can keep things from impacting that bottom wire and breaking it, that's less fencing for you to have to do, as you've got those miles and miles of work. And then Brett, you get to use this whole different language and look at measurements, and we know that Pronghorn likes to have it this high, you know, a muley likes to have it this low, type of a thing, and you're looking at it from a completely different lens, but we're ending at a similar result. So give me this fencing in terms of wildlife specs. What do you all see in your quote unquote dream fence that would be good for wildlife that we see up here in the northern Great Plains?
Yeah, I'll start. So I guess I'll preface it with looking at it. You know, fencing is a requirement of the landscape, and I look at it as fencing is required here because not only of the agricultural practices, but fencing keeps cattle on the ground keeps grass on the ground. Grass benefits all wildlife, whether you're a small passerine, a small bird on the prairie that migrates through, or you're a large ungulate like an antelope or a deer, or even an elk in some cases. So fencing is critical to have, and it's working together in partnership to improve it that helps just all parties involved. So when we look at fencing, the general specification for wildlife friendly fencing that's kind of utilized all throughout the West, in the Western states and Canadian provinces, is there's some slight variation, but it's usually about a 42-inch strand top wire, and then a 12-inch spacing between, and this is 4-strand fence, I'm sorry, about 12-inch spacing between the top strand and then the next strand. And you need that little additional spacing there, because what has been learned over time, you know, primarily looking at the mule deer, how they've evolved in the prairie system, how they jump, you know, it's stotting, it's different than whitetails. If you watch a mule deer jump a fence, it tucks its back legs up to its abdomen. And when you've got those top two wires too close and they clip it, that's where you get those hooves tangled into and wrapped into those top two. So that 12-inch spacing there has enough distance between those two wires that if for some reason a mule deer clips that top wire, there's enough space that they won't catch that next wire and start to entangle. Then going from that wire to the next one, usually about 8 or 9 inches between the second and third wire. And when you get to the bottom wire, what's typically preferred, it started off in the research of about 16 inches between the bottom wire to the ground. Now it's shown to be about 18 inches is kind of preferable, but anything between that 16 to 18 inches from the bottom wire to the ground allows for the safe passage of most antelope movements and really a lot of mule deer movements. You know, a lot of people, when they see a mule deer, they obviously see it jump the fence. But when there is just a natural flow of animal movement across the landscape that isn't pressured, you know, by a pickup pulling up along the fence that's making them jump the fence, a lot of mule deer prefer to actually slip under as well, like an antelope does. So that 16 to 18 inch spacing is really critical for it. You know, and preferably in a perfect world, a lot of that would be smooth wire, that bottom wire. But with that spacing, I know like on some of Mark's pastures, we did 18 inches, but the preference was barbed. That still allows for good wildlife movement, helps maintain, keep the calves and the cattle and the cows in. And there is enough distance there that, you know, when you get a young calf that may slip on the wrong side of the fence, mom's still on the right side of the fence, and that calf comes back inevitably to the proper side of the fence. So that's kind of the general 4-strand wildlife friendly fence that we look at. There's been some different names for wildlife friendly fence. I know the Montana Department of Transportation has just changed theirs to Martin, I'm having a little, it's modified farm fence that they changed it to now. So, because there sometimes is a negative connotation when you hear wildlife friendly fence that and you hear the term permeability, movement across the landscape, like I am going to lose my calves, my cows are going to slip through, or my sheep. Obviously, it's a whole different degree with fencing requirements for them. But yeah, MDT and some of the conservation partners now have taken the name modified farm fence and are pushing that forward full scale. So, but the specifications of the wires and the distances are the same.
It's like you guys are doing my work for me. I always emphasize just how important words are in people's perception. And it really is. When you say wildlife friendly, people kind of might get their hackles up that, oh, it's not going to be for livestock. It's just focused on this permeability for wildlife. But it's the same thing as now this farm friendly fence or however you worded it, Brett. You mentioned sheep. And so I did do some crowdsourcing for some questions ahead of this. And one of our producers, she's from a family very wildlife friendly. Of course, when it gets to their cattle operations, they utilize this sort of fencing. But she's got goats, and goats don't work with a 16 to 18 inch, bottom wire. And so she said, we try to make sure and open gates when the pastures are not in use. But is there any other strategy to help wildlife while still keeping the goats contained? So, Brett, you're responding to this one. I'll go ahead and let you give your answer because you're nodding along.
Yeah, yeah, goats and sheep, even with a woven wire fence, boy, are they tough to keep in. And it's with those producers on the landscape, and that's their livelihood. Those are their critters. It's tough to make a wildlife friendly fence that can also keep goats or sheep in. And what it sounds like this individual is doing is exactly what we'd recommend. When the pastures aren't in use, keeping the gates open, that can still facilitate ample wildlife movement as needed. Yeah, there's no easy quick fix or silver bullet to do, one section in between T-posts or cedar posts to make wildlife friendly, because we know the goats or the sheep are going to find it. So it just comes down to, if a pasture's not in use and the landowner is open to it, leaving those gates open and for a lot of the wildlife out there in the landscape, and I mean, even as you get some older livestock, they know the landscape. They've had a behavioral adaptation to it. Those antelope, those mule deer, over their lifespan, and even handed down from mom and everything like that. They know where the gates are that are open. When you've got that variation in wire height, as some of the fences sag and everything like that, they know where they're able to clear it, and they're able to go back to those sections. Yeah, sheep and goats are tough, but really just leaving the gates open is the best we can do in situations like that.
But I think that's an interesting point you bring up, Brett, of like their memory to go to the same spot. Because when had the game cameras on Marks, there's 10 cameras. 2 of them took most of the pictures.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, they're on that camera line. I believe you're referencing the one right there by Mark's house along the road. Yeah, I mean there's a lot of variation in that wire height, and there's other areas where the antelope most certainly could have crossed safely. But they've got that fidelity to keep going back to that one space. And that's a good thing to bring up. There was another fence that appeared to be a barrier in the southern portion of Phillips County. And some of it was on BLM fence, and Tom Darrington at the time was in the office, and him and I went out in the field to look at it, and it was a fence that they had actually removed and replaced with wildlife friendly fence. But the behavioral knowledge and the increased permeability of that section of the fence hadn't been learned by the antelope yet. It was 18-inch spacing on the bottom wire. So it'll take a couple of generations, when you address a barrier that's out there on the landscape. There is certain times where it's not an instantaneous, acknowledgement of, boy, I can move freely now. It takes a little bit of learning and trial and error for some of this wildlife to realize that this is now permeable. I can move through it. But for the generations prior to them, it wasn't. So like in a herd behavior or behavior handed down from mom to fawn or yearling or anything like that, it takes a little bit of knowledge to relearn that landscape when there is some fixes out there. So yeah, it's very interesting to watch them key in on, 100 mile movements, and they know annually where they're going to that fence. Obviously, if there's snow or something like that, there's going to be some back and forth until they find it, but they can key in, and they've got the fidelity and that knowledge that's been handed down and learned on the landscape. They adhere to that pretty well.
So
Like our
Brett, I'm going to take this to Brett, as you're discussing this, the fact that these generations of antelope have this learned knowledge and this handed down knowledge. Mark, I'm throwing it over to you on your ranch because you have multi-generations there. You have watched these antelope through the years and witnessed where they cross, what they do. How has maybe the perception of wildlife or the acknowledgement of wildlife and how they react to things, how has that been managed from generation to generation within what you all do on your ranch?
Well, a lot of the similar things like Brett talked about, in the off season, you just leave some gates open. You have less repairs and then you follow their tracks. They got a certain trail. And one thing that was before Brett came along, I remember putting a brand new fence in. And I remember the antelope breaking the bottom wire. So there's a learned response from the landowner too that, hey, we need this wire up higher. Brett and I talked, said, 18, that's kind of high. That's kind of my minimum. I like that up there quite a ways because, like they said, the calves can pass freely and the livestock can too. Less maintenance, less breakdowns and stuff. And yeah, the learned response is not just on the wildlife, it's on the ranchers too. So I've learned that if I work with them, then we can get along really good, the wildlife. And then thank goodness there's programs that facilitate this, that helps us both out.
Yeah, and some of that first antelope research that came off of like the Matador, basically they would take the bottom wire and kept moving it up and up and up and figured out how high they could get away with before it stopped containing livestock. And they settled on that 16 to 18 because it was 99% as effective as any other height off the ground.
One of our previous podcasts talked about virtual fencing, and we had Tyrell Obrecht and Leo Barthelmess with us, and I'll link that in the show notes here so people can listen back to that one if they haven't already. And this collaring of livestock to create boundaries was a huge interest. It continues to be something that, as an organization, we constantly get folks in media wanting to talk to us about. But I'm curious about collaring antelope. Brett, how does that function work? I mean, it's one thing for cattle, we've got chutes and such, but how do you all go about going into a herd of antelope and throwing collars on? How many do you have to have per herd? Give us those details.
Yeah. So yeah, much different in the wildlife realm. So our typical wildlife captures occur in the winter, and there's a multitude of factors for it. I'll just brush over a few of them. You always got to look at thermal regulation because it's a stressful environment. So we don't do it in the summer when it's really hot, and then also in the spring and the summer you've got newborn calves or fawns on the ground and everything like that. So it added stress and separation. So we do a lot of our captures in the winter, and we do it utilizing a helicopter and a capture crew, a mugging crew. So me as the biologist when I was in Malta, we kind of know where we want to have the distribution of collars. It'd be great if you can collar way more individuals, but ultimately, like anything in the world, it comes down to time and finances. So you look at finding a representation across the landscape, and both a representation in the density of collars that you're putting out there. If you've got an area that winters about 50 to 100 antelope, putting 2 or 3 collars out there is more than likely going to be beneficial for you to gain the knowledge. Because what we found from some of the research is some of the antelope we classify as a resident herd, and some of them are migratory. So in that portion of Phillips County, it's kind of a coin flip. You've got about 50%, give or take, that are residential antelope that don't really do long scale movements. They might hop around just based on the season of use. And you've got some that do 100 or more mile movements. So getting a handful in a representative herd like that helps kind of capture that behavior that's on the landscape, and it also helps facilitate for the potential of a mortality. So if you only were to put out 1, maybe 2 collars in a herd, and you have a early mortality, you've kind of lost that data collection for that area. So typically, I think I said it earlier, in our captures, we capture about 60 individuals. in a herd, or where we're looking to go for the landscape level. And that's been kind of right in the sweet spot of giving us enough statistical knowledge of what's going out there in the population, as well as being right there in that financial sweet spot, because it is pricey to bring in a helicopter, bring in the mugging crew, the capture crew, and the collars themselves, are a couple $1,000s a piece. So, and there's a lot of staff time involved in it. So, in a perfect world, what we would go through is we would look at the herd estimation or population estimation out there on the landscape, and then we would do a power analysis to see how many. And that might vary from, hey, the 60 works great, or in all reality, we need 300 or 400, and that's just that's not really with the funds available something we can do. So more often than not, it's kind of in that 50 to 80 to or maybe 100 individual category of where we're collaring and putting them out there. But we do it in the winter. We have a spotter plane. In this case, when I was up in Malta, I was in the spotter plane flying with a pilot. And the spotter plane is always working ahead of the helicopter with the capture crew, staying on where you want, staying on the herd of where you want to put out collars. The capture crew is working on the herd that you just got done finding for them. And they get on the herd of antelope. And obviously, once again, being cognizant of fences, because we don't want to run animals both for their safety through fences, and also for ranchers putting an extra section of fence that they got to go out there in the spring and fix. So the capture crew gets on top of the herd, usually within about 10 to 20 feet, and they shoot a net gun, and it's typically an 8 or a 10 by 10 foot mesh net that goes over them with weights on it. And it wraps up the antelope, and having that snow coverage on the ground really reduces the potential for injury or anything like that. When we get those winters where we don't have that snow coverage and it's just that hard ground, it's very similar to tackling something on asphalt, and it's just not conducive for anybody or any animal. So capture with that. Once they're on the ground, the capture crew and some of our research biologists go out there. We take blood samples. We take age estimation on it. With antelope, it's really easy. You can look at their incisors and age them really, really easily from fawn to about 4.5 years of age. We affix the collar. We get that working. We can do a pregnancy test or any kind of like biological kind of measurements that we want to do, whether it's rump fats or anything like that. And then we release them, and that all gets done in about anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes. We really want to reduce the stress on them. And then that capture crew is back up in the air, coming back to the spotter plane where I'm at to move on to the next group of antelope. So it's not as easy as running them through a chute, and by no means am I saying utilizing a chute is easy either. I mean, it's hard work, but there's some difference there in putting collars on cattle versus antelope.
Can I come? I want to see
Right.
this.
That's the number one question. And it's tough just because of the dangers involved in that situation. I know at Mark's place, we were able to facilitate a fuel up station where the fuel trailer came in and the helicopter was able to land, and him and his son and some others were able to check out the helicopter, and I think the capture net gun and everything like that. I would love to be in the helicopter doing the capture as well, but instead I find myself crammed in the backseat of a Super Cub when it's -35 and just waiting for the day to be over.
All of this information, I love to look at things from an animal welfare perspective, and you did very well, Brett, in laying out how you best try to protect the animal in the situation that you're doing it. But at the end of the day, you're doing this to create an atmosphere fence-wise that's better for that population at large. And so the grand effect is something that's better for those pronghorn herds. What have you learned from this? And then identify how that brings in Mark's ranch and making sure that he is a place that's identified for improvements and assistance for improvements to wildlife friendly fencing.
Yeah, so once those collars are deployed, depending on the study and on the collar that we're utilizing, some of them got different battery longevity rates and everything like that, but we're typically getting a location every couple of hours. And it does not take long before all of a sudden you're seeing these dots and then adding the lines to them, and you're seeing these movements across the landscape, and you're seeing these barriers or potential barriers. So then it comes down to ground truthing, meeting with the landowners, talking with them, seeing their thoughts on it, right? We have very good landowners on the landscape, Mark being one of them, his family, and working with them and the conversation, you have to be cognizant, right? Everybody's out there, multi-generational, like the French family. It's not that we go in there and say, hey, there's an issue on the ground, we're realizing it. It's like, how can we work together? How can we better your agricultural operation while also helping with the herd health of the pronghorn or the mule deer or the elk out on the landscape, and finding that partnership of where we can go together. And that involves, ranch days, taking down fence, assisting, applying for the NIFWIF grant that we did with the Ranch Stewardship Alliance, getting those funds on the ground and building that partnership, building that cohesive network, and just that desire to improve both the agricultural operation as well as wildlife facilitation for movements and access to resources on the landscape. Because as one would imagine, when there's barriers on the landscape, not only is there an energetic deficit that they're having as they're trying to navigate the landscape when they reach those fences, but also when there's a barrier on the other side of the fence. I mean, it might be great native range, but technically that's removed from the landscape for them if they can't access it. So it doesn't facilitate any nutrition for them or anything like that, or any habitat requirements they might have if they can't make that movement. And when we get those hard winters, I always think back to, I lived in Glasgow in the 2010-2011 winter. I think it was 108 inches that we received that winter. It was a record. And unfortunately, in really catastrophic winters like that, if whether it's cows or sheep or antelope or deer, if you can't get the forage to them and they can't move to any kind of thermal cover that they need, it's detrimental. And in a winter like that, I think we all know it doesn't matter if it's an 18-inch bottom wire or not. There's not going to be any crossings underneath the fence when you get those snow drifts. So that's once again where it comes back to open gates are really critical. You're always trying to look at creating good partnerships and doing the best you can for the animals. But when you get those outlier years, it can just be tough regardless of what you've done out there.
Martin, we just got a layup from Brett. We sometimes get asked, what does the Rancher Stewardship Alliance do? And we do a lot in education, and we're working on a succession planning program and bringing networks of people together. But the layup here is that Rancher Stewardship Alliance also can help with funding. And Mark alluded to it earlier, that there are resources available for ranches that maybe want to implement some of these things. So let's talk a little bit about NIFWIF, how that plays into a project like this.
Yeah, so National Fish and Wildlife Foundation is a grant sourcing partner we've used for most of our conservation program. In the early days of RSA's conservation program, nobody worked here, so we relied on partners. So Brett was one of those partners that helped us work with those grants. 2019, there started being a nation or a west-wide effort on big game focus. So NIFWIF put out a big game program. We applied for it. That was the first offshoot of that. Since then, between us and partners, we've gotten 6 NIFWIF grants to help work on fences, and we've really expanded our work with Bureau of Land Management as well. So between them and a few private foundations, we put together a program that helps landowners tackle fences that are a maintenance issue to them, an age issue to them, a problem for them, and try to line that up with wildlife data. And the nice thing about Brett having that study here is we have data. So that's a huge thing in conservation programs, is if you have data and you can show that there's an issue, it's usually in your favor to then find the funding to fix it. So that collar study produced a fence layer that ranked fences on how restricted they've been found for antelope. Every year we tackle a few of those. We try to work then with landowners that voluntarily come in and say, hey, I have a fence that I know is an issue. If we don't have data around it, we just look at it, and usually we can do those ones as well. And then as that program grows, involving more partners, involving more geography, and then hopefully involving more data collection. So it's still an ongoing thing. We have some other partners that are still working on data collection on antelope. There's a Canadian project right now that has some collared antelope that I know are floating around our area. Just really trying to make sure we keep that momentum going. Because before we started recording, Mark and I were joking, there's an endless amount of fence. I don't know the actual amounts of fence we have in our area, but we could do this program all day, every day, forever, and still not get through even just the identified restricted fences. So trying to make sure that we have some option out there to keep that going has been big for us. It's very new in conservation that we've been able to do boundary fences and fence work like this. Like, it's a very, very new thing in the last 6 years. So just getting it up and going, really. Like, we've done, I think last count, RSA has been a part of at least 250 miles of fencing being improved, either just moving wire heights on fences that still had maintenance capability, or just replacing fences that can't hang anymore. And then some other partners have worked on bigger and bigger programs that I know has contributed a ton of extra support across Eastern Montana.
Mark, I'm curious, when you first started doing this on your ranch, did you approach RSA and say, I had a problem? Did Martin approach you and say, hey, I think I've got some money that can help you? Did you think he was crazy? How did this initially start for you and your ranch operation?
Actually, through the block management program, I got to know Brett real well, and we, a few shop nights, got together and then visited. And, there's a background story there too, but anyway, we just got to know each other, and he just happened to mention the program, and being we were already, the ranch is already cooperating with the block management, and that's how we developed a relationship. And he asked if we'd be interested, and I said, that sounds like a good idea to me. There's so much fence. And then we did a little drive around with research. Brett came out, we kind of did a little drive by. And the funny thing was, Brett and I and my nephew were driving down the road, and there's a herd of antelope running down the county road, and they're bouncing from old wire, low dilapidated barbed wire fence on both sides. And we slowed way down. Brett gets his phone out and says, this is exactly what I'm talking about. And I said, yeah, they can't find a place to cross until they come up maybe to an open gate and then went through. But that was exactly the example we were looking for. And then after that, I replaced some fence, and I saw antelope coming through one field, crossing the highway, and there's a vehicle coming. I thought, but that antelope buck never even slowed down. That antelope friendly fence, he went through it at full speed where it had been replaced. So yeah, I kind of got sidetracked on here, but Brett and I, through the block management program, working with the wildlife, and then he proposed it to us, and then we adapted it, and then we've had some great examples of it with it collaring and all that. And actually, that's what made me pay more attention to it, is when the helicopter lands and they showed us the gun and all the fun stuff that we wished you could do. Just like you said, Haylie, yeah, I wish I could have rode along too. So
I am reading a book right now, and it's called Chase the Fun. And it's just about those little, snippets like that in your day that just light you up. And how do we get more involved with stuff like that? And so I think that that's the perfect example. And I think too, Mark, from the relationship of, wildlife conservation, those buzzwords over to ranchers, and, anytime we use the word conservation, people sometimes have a weird relationship with it. But at the end of the day, it's this relationship between you and Brett, and it's a trusting relationship, and between you and the Ranchers Stewardship Alliance. And it's not saying, hey, Mark, here's what you should do on your ranch, but it's having those conversations about here's things that could happen. And if it's something that works for you, here's ways that we can help to facilitate it. So it's so much more of an organic, another buzzword that people can have reactions to, but it's just those relationships that can really promote some real change. So I think that that's just an incredible story. Mark, I did want to mention, as we headed into this conversation, I said I was going to try to wear my naysayer hat, because I know that everybody on this call really subscribes to this concept of whether it's farm friendly or wildlife friendly, whatever this fencing style is, it's something that we all subscribe to. But you mentioned that you have stuff along the highway. Do you interact with things along the highway fencing wise, Mark, differently than you would an internal non-boundary type fence?
Oh, as far as what do you mean more? What do you mean?
Would you have your bottom wire any lower because you're more worried about those calves popping out, or do you just keep them universal across the ranch?
I keep them universal across the ranch because, like, I've seen some of the literature around here, and it's been said before about the small calf getting through. He's a bit more apt to get back through. Something will push him through, and then, if he can voluntarily go back without being running up and down the road. And so the fence I put in is pretty much universal all around the ranch. And the updates, speaking of stuff getting out on the highways and stuff, a lot of these fences that are old are right along the highway, and by updating them, it's made that when mama stays in, more likely all of them are gonna stay in. So that's what's been such a great, asset, this program for the rancher too. It's helping me, the security of the ranch, keeping the livestock off the road, keeping the antelope off the road. It's safer for everyone concerned that they don't get hung up on the highway. People don't run into my cows or the wildlife. Everybody's a lot happier in the long run. So I think it's a win I don't see the negative of this program at all. I see the positive, all the way around.
And I'm sure Brett can get into it with better numbers, but one of the biggest issues is animals not being able to get off of the highway. It's not so much that they got on, it's that they can't get off. So having these fences is beneficial on that side.
Yeah, through that big game grant that RSA received, we were able to utilize collision data, wildlife collision data from the Montana Department of Transportation. And when you get on the ground and you look, there are some fences that are more permeable for wildlife on one side of the road, and there are some that are more restrictive on the other side of the road. And for Mark's example, he did a great job when he talked about that buck antelope being able to just make that one movement across it, so the road. So when we look at a project like that, it brings in an additional partner. And Martin said it, human safety. We want to facilitate one quick, succinct movement across that road if that's for wildlife movement, what is required. So that involves, in Mark's case, it was perfect. He owned the property on both sides of the road. So we put in that wildlife friendly fencing, and we no longer saw any movements of pronghorn in the burrow pit trying to find a crossing spot. So they were able to just do that one quick movement from one side of 191 to the other side. It helps energetically for the antelope, but it helps for safety for all the commuters utilizing the road. So yeah, that's one thing with the collar data, finding those barriers where it may hang up either an individual or a herd of antelope or deer on the road, trying to make that just one safe passage for them. But also working with MDT, human safety and everything like that. We do find areas where MDT does have to come in and do exclusionary fencing, where they're, I'm sure many of us have had it where, especially when you're driving south on 191, there's a lot of hills, and if you come over a hill and there's something standing there, it doesn't give you a lot of time to stop. So in some situations where you've got a long flat that you've got better line of distance, further line of distance, wildlife friendly fencing to get that nice movement across the road can work. But yeah, where there's hills or some kind of topography or some kind of issue, that's where we have to work with MDT and the landowners that maybe exclusionary fencing is just better for human safety, and find somewhere to kind of funnel antelope or deer movements somewhere more safe where there's a better line of sight, and they can get their movement across the road without causing a risk for the traffic.
Well, guys, I have almost taken up a full hour of your time, which is exactly where I said I put my limit at. So as we kind of start to tie this conversation up with a bow, we've identified the importance of wildlife-friendly fence, both from the wildlife side as well as the rancher side of things, and that it's just almost a sensical fence, for lack of a better, I could make a fancier term for that, but it just seems like it's a fence that makes sense. So we've also identified that there's funding and assistance available, especially if now, because we have this data that's telling us migration patterns are, we can focus some of those energies, as both Mark and Martin alluded to in their conversation. The miles of fence are endless. So of course we want to do it all, but there are places that we can focus that energy and make the most impact with the current resources that are available. Martin, what sort of current efforts are there to go through and continue this progress of the transition to wildlife friendly, farm friendly, whatever you want to call it, fencing?
Yeah, so I think really anything conservation. We try to take these small grant funded efforts and scale them up. So there's been a lot of effort. Pheasants Forever worked with NRCS to put together a big game program that mostly looked at fencing and other projects that starting next year will be available across all of eastern Montana. Another thing USDA does is basically anytime we can get a conservation project with some success going, if it scales up, USDA can very, very much multiply the amount we can do. So USDA has a big game program. It started in Wyoming. It's coming to Montana next. So that's something we're starting to work with. And then we've mentioned a little bit in different podcasts, Montana Grassland Partnership. It's basically an effort of those of us that work together in this area, areas south of the Missouri River and other areas, and basically the flat part of Montana to try to all work together. When we're in this part of Montana, if we can get some program interest to come to this side, let's try to get more. So I know Brett and some other people in southeast Montana have been visiting. We're trying to work with Department of Transportation where they're already working on fences to basically tack onto those efforts and spread them out. And then we're working basically to get an inventory of where we have data, where we have need, where we have interest, where we have opportunity, and then see how much that costs and work with project funders, grants, foundations, USDA, BLM, and others to see if we can put together programs that fund those. And that's been big just from the coordination of if we know we have basically opportunities for a lot of ground to be gained in different areas. If we have partners working together, let's reinforce those and spread out from there. I know like this project started with a focus area in the middle of South Phillips County and another one in Valley County, and they've just spread out from there. So basically we go to one ranch, we go to the next ranch, we go to the next ranch, and all of a sudden we've went 100 miles in every direction. So really trying to have it be successful in an area and then spread from there.
So as we look to that situation and the continuation of this program, I'm going to go ahead and say we've got two big challenges right now to a lot of what we do. Number one, currently there is a freeze on some federal funding. We don't want to live in that world of this is imminent and negative. We're going to keep on plugging forward. But I do want to at least not ignore that some of that funding being frozen does impact some of the work forward on these projects. And we don't need to dive any further into that. But the other one is the logistics on the ground in that we need more fencers. So Martin, if somebody wants to be an entrepreneur and make good money and live in Malta, Glasgow, Chinook, somewhere on Montana's High Line, tell them you've got a job for them.
Yeah. We struggle with conservation contractors always in every version because conservation funding is very cyclical, very boom and bust. So we've had a hard time ramping up businesses or people that want to do it and have interest because we might have 40 miles this year, we might have 0 next year. So like last year, we contracted 60 some miles of fencing across a bunch of projects. You mentioned the federal funding freeze. I had to tell 7 of those 8 ranches, hey, maybe give us a minute. So we're slowing down for a second, but trying to make sure we still have that work around as we have contractors that can do this. A lot of landowners do their own fencing. So especially when we're working with ranches that had that fence on their to-do list anyways, we're able to have that work out. Sometimes we struggle, especially on these identified barrier fences. Usually a fence that's a barrier to wildlife is doing a really good job of keeping cows where they're supposed to be. So it's kind of hard to get somebody to voluntarily go from a fence to a fence. So those ones we're usually providing a contractor, paying a little better if people are interested in that. So that gets more predictable. We have some contract work when we're working alongside like Bureau of Land Management. They do a lot of contracting and have some demand. So we always tend to find the limit of contracting because usually when we have a lot of work available, so does BLM, so does other groups. We had one fence contractor last year, got a whole separate entity contract that we had no idea about. We were approaching him with 25 miles of fence. He got a contract for 40. And that took one of our 5 or less fence contractors completely out of the pool. So I don't think there's a fence contractor. Like we said, there's endless amounts of fence. I don't think there's a fence contractor that's low on fencing to do.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get into kind of our final thoughts today. And I'm going to let Brett, you start. Once you're done with final thoughts, Mark, it'll go to you, and then we'll let Martin wrap up with his final thoughts.
Perfect. Yeah. You know, I've been amazed, both at when I was in Malta, as well as now down here in Miles City, of what RSA has been able to do. And working with the landowners, working with the agencies, working with the NGOs. We as scientific managers tried our best to gather as much data to find those best places for the limited financial resources. And I wanted to make sure to emphasize, we only know what we know really from those collar data. And a point was brought up earlier about getting out on the ranch and maybe where the collar data isn't, that landowner says, hey, I've got a section of a fence where I know animals cross. And that has been critical over my whole tenure as a wildlife professional. Those landowners that work that ground, run those cattle or sheep day in and day out, they know that landscape about as good as the wildlife do. So working and building that partnership and just being partners together and having that conversation and that shared interest, you learn more out on the landscape than what a collar can show you or what you think you know or what a book in college told you. So I think building that relationship, coming into a group like RSA and being a member of it and seeing all the different perspectives, in all reality, the sky's the limit, between the interest, the projects, the potential funding sources. I really appreciate working with a group like this, as well as many other groups. But working together is how we're going to keep ag on the landscape, as well as do the best we can for wildlife management and to help facilitate those movements and just keep the landscape the way we want to see the landscape. Cows out on the landscape, animals on the landscape, and just everybody working together and being a member of the community.
Okay, as a rancher's perspective, that's what I was asked in here for. I wanted to remind everybody, all of my fellow ranchers, to keep an open mind about all these new projects and stuff. Everything's changing, the world's changing so fast. You need to keep more of an open mind. It seems like the time is faster and everything, but there's a lot of these. I recommend that if you're not sure or you're real negative on a project, well, maybe study it and see what's actually. Open the book up and read it a little bit. Don't just have a closed mind. So as far as a rancher goes, I would encourage a lot of ranchers just to look into these projects. Do the research, because there's a lot of things that can work for both, or we can work both together. So and that's what I found out with this project. Brett was nice enough to mention this was available, and then we looked into it and thought this would work for us. So keep an open mind anyway.
Yeah, and I think my favorite thing that's come out of this big game work has been that research that then turned into a project. Like we've stared at those collar maps at your place and neighbors' places so many times. If you see the pinpoint of where an antelope went, where it bounced off the fence a bunch of times, and that's the fence we're going to work on. I know there's one shop up north. They have their map hung up in that shop. They loved it. So I think as a rancher, seeing that you can have an impact on wildlife habitat at landscape scale is really neat. Like, I know, Brett, you mentioned one antelope made a 100-mile circle one day. Like, just to see that one antelope spent time on your place, headed out, and then came back. That's so cool to see and then be part of. So I think we mentioned how we use it for funding and making conservation programs go, but it's just really, really useful and like meaningful information to have about ranch management that I think is a neat thing that this kind of work brings to ranchers that has been fun to be a part of.
And that wraps up this episode of the Ranch Stewards Podcast. A huge thank you to our guests, Martin Townsend, Mark French, and Brett Dorak, for sharing their insight. Wildlife-friendly fencing, it's also known as modified farm fencing. Too often people try to frame ranching and wildlife conservation as opposing forces, but that is just not the case. And the two are part of the same storyline, one where good stewardship creates a landscape that benefits both livestock and wildlife. So again, if you enjoyed the conversation, please be sure to subscribe, stay connected with us for more discussions on stewardship, sustainability, and the future of ranching. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time on the Ranch Stewards Podcast.
You've been listening to the Ranch Stewards Podcast, a project of the Rancher Stewardship Alliance. If you like what you heard, head to ranchstewards.org for added content or follow the Rancher Stewardship Alliance on Facebook and Instagram.